Why was she so quiet when everyone else was shouting? The room hummed with nervous energy, cadets packing and stretching, pretending not to size one another up. Yet she stood alone by the edge of the mats, head lowered, wrapping her hands with white athletic tape in slow, practiced folds. No wasted movement. No need to announce herself. The first voice to cut through the noise wasn't hers. "Look what we have here, boys." Another diversity hire sent to lower the standards. The words dropped like stones into the Crucible's wide hall. Sergeant Marcus Thorne's laughter carried with him, joined by the sycophantic chuckles of his two shadows, Jenkins and Ali. He stood tall, chest inflated, savoring the role he'd appointed himself, king of this place. His gaze was fixed on the new girl. But she didn't even look up, didn't blink, didn't rise to the bait. Her silence filled the room with a strange, heavy tension. Thorne stepped closer, grinning wider, as if trying to draw from her what she refused to give: fear, anger, anything that would prove his dominance was real. But she gave nothing. She simply pressed down the tape with finality, the faint silver scars on her knuckles catching the fluorescent light. From above, on the shadowed deck, General Hayes leaned forward. He wasn't watching Thorne. His eyes were locked on the woman's stance. A weight distribution, subtle but unmistakable, a perfect economy of balance. He knew what the cadets didn't. This was no rookie fumbling into the lion's den. This was something else. Thorne smirked. "Seriously, sweetheart, did you get lost on your way to admin? This is where the warriors train. Wouldn't want you to break a nail." The laughter grew louder, but her silence didn't break. She glanced at him only once, a brief, unreadable look, then back to her hands, folding, pressing, as though his words had been nothing more than background static. That tiny nod of acknowledgement was worse than any insult. It dismissed him completely. His jaw tightened. He had to win this. Not just the sparring to come, but this unspoken contest of presence. His anger built, boiling into the stale gym air. The moment cracked when Master Sergeant Croft barked from the side, voice gravelly and commanding. "Listen up. Final evaluation starts now. King of the Hill. Last three standing get my recommendation. The rest, logistics. Move." A murmur rippled through the cadets. Months of suffering, sweat, and drills had led to this moment. Before anyone else could step forward, Thorne thrust his hand high. "I'll go first, Sergeant, and I'll take the new candidate. Let's get the easy one out of the way." The crowd chuckled nervously. Some looked away, uneasy but unwilling to intervene. Croft's eyes narrowed but gave a curt nod. He had seen arrogance like this before, and the forge of the Crucible often burned such pride away. The girl finished the last strip of tape, pressed it flat with deliberate care, then rose. Only then did the cadets see her properly. Not tall, not broad, compact, every line of her frame dense with purpose. She moved forward step by step with a fluid stillness that unsettled even those watching. Her name was Vance, officer candidate, but as she stepped into the circle opposite Thorne, the Crucible itself seemed to still. To her, the jeers faded. The blur of faces dissolved into a gray periphery. Only the geometry of the mat mattered. The space between herself and the man bouncing on his heels, grinning for his audience. He was preparing for a fight. She was simply arriving at work. "Begin." Thorne lunged, a roar ripping from his chest, fist arcing in a haymaker so powerful the cadets braced for impact. But just as it was about to land, she vanished. Not a dodge, not a block, a pivot. 15 degrees just enough. His punch sliced through empty air. Her left hand brushed his elbow, her right pressed his hip. Not resistance, only redirection. He stumbled forward, eyes wide with confusion, almost falling under his own momentum. The room froze. The impact they expected never came. Humiliation burned across his face. He spun, charged again, wild this time, sloppy with rage. And she met him not with force but with fluid precision. A shift, a grip, a step across his body. In one smooth sequence, he was airborne. For a breathless second, Marcus Thorne hung weightless above the mat. Then he crashed down. The sound was deafening. Before he could even gasp, she was on him, her knee pinning his shoulder, his arm locked in place, the pressure one heartbeat away from breaking bone. Silence fell. 3 seconds. That's all it had taken. She hadn't thrown a punch. She hadn't even raised her voice. She had simply disassembled him. The cadets gawked. The arrogance they had fed minutes before shattered in front of them. "That's not possible," Thorne gasped. Measured footsteps echoed down the steel staircase. General Hayes descended, each step a hammer strike in the suffocating quiet. He didn't look at Thorne, didn't look at the crowd. His eyes were on her. "The parry was textbook Krav Maga," he said evenly. "But the throw, that was Systema. Who was your instructor?" At last Vance spoke. Her voice was calm, without pride or explanation. "Master Chief Petty Officer Thorne, sir, my father." Gasps rippled through the ranks. The name carried weight. Master Chief Thorne was legend, a ghost in the machine of modern special warfare. Croft fumbled with his tablet when Hayes ordered her file read aloud. What he found left the room in stunned disbelief. Prior service, U.S. Navy. Rank, Chief Petty Officer. Unit, Naval Special Warfare Development Group DVGRU, Tier 1. Awards, Navy Cross, Silver Star, Purple Heart. The cadets who had mocked her stood pale and hollow-eyed, realizing the depth of their ignorance. And then the unthinkable. General Hayes raised his hand in a perfect, formal salute, not to a cadet, not to a trainee, to a warrior of the highest order. "Chief Vance," he said, "it is an honor." The air trembled with the weight of it, and in that moment the Crucible wasn't just a training hall. It was a courtroom of character, a place where arrogance had been crushed and quiet strength revealed its face. Sometimes the loudest man in the room is nothing more than an echo, and sometimes the one who says nothing at all holds the kind of power that no roar can match. Why did no one speak when the general saluted her? For a moment the entire Crucible seemed suspended in air, as if gravity itself had paused to register what had just happened. The general's hand lowered with slow precision, and Vance returned to her neutral stance. No smile, no triumph, no acknowledgement of the awe around her. She had not asked for this moment. She had simply endured it. When Hayes turned and left the floor, the silence remained like smoke after a fire. No one knew what to say. The cadets who had laughed the loudest now stared at their shoes. Jenkins and Ali looked hollow, the color drained from their faces. Even Croft, whose face was usually carved from granite, seemed shaken. Thorne lay on his back, eyes darting, chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. He had been dismantled in front of everyone, not by brute force but by something worse, effortless control. And the truth that stung deepest, she hadn't even been trying. By that evening, whispers ran wild. At first the story was simple. Thorne got taken down by the new girl, but whispers never stayed simple. They grew teeth. She never even punched him. She had him broken in seconds. The general saluted her. By nightfall, the details of her file had already leaked. The Navy Cross, DEVGRU, 2,000 combat hours. The cadets repeated the words like they were handling sacred relics. Each repetition made the legend heavier. Some called her the ghost, others whispered the chief, a living myth hiding in plain fatigues. Thorne heard it all. He sat alone in the barracks, staring at the floor while the others replayed the leaked footage on their tablets, every frame dissected, every pause analyzed. They marveled at her balance, her precision. No one laughed anymore. And he, once the loudest voice in every room, said nothing. The next morning, Hayes summoned him. Thorne stood stiff before the general's desk, stripped of his swagger, staring at his reflection in the polished wood. "You have talent," Hayes said, his voice low, more devastating than any yell. "But your ego writes checks your experience cannot cash. You stood in the presence of greatness and saw only a threat to your pride. Chief Vance has carried lives in her hands. She has bled for this flag. and you treated her like an inconvenience." The words landed like blows. Hayes didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. When Thorne left the office, he was no longer cadet commander. Stripped of his small kingdom, he wandered the base like a ghost of his former self. The swagger was gone. His friends, if they had ever been friends, avoided his eyes. For days he carried shame like a weight. Meanwhile, Vance moved quietly through the academy as though nothing had changed. She spoke little, stayed out of gossip, never mentioned her past. When cadets approached her, nervous and hesitant, she didn't push them away. She showed them how to adjust their stance, corrected their grips, guided their breathing on the firing range. She taught with a precision that was merciless yet patient, never raising her voice. It unsettled some. How could someone so accomplished remain so silent about it? But that silence itself was the lesson. Even Jenkins, once Thorne's echo, watched her with a mix of fear and reverence. He replayed the throw in his head, the way she had ended the fight without anger, without even breaking rhythm. It was more terrifying than raw strength. And so slowly the Crucible changed. Cadets who once bragged the loudest began to speak softer, watching one another with new eyes. They studied hands, not words, posture, not bravado. Thorne avoided her at first, ashamed, until 1 week later. On the firing range, he found her instructing younger cadets on marksmanship. He waited until she finished, his hands tightening and loosening at his sides. When he finally stepped forward, his voice was low. "Chief, what I said, what I did, there's no excuse. I was arrogant, I was wrong, I'm sorry." She looked at him for a long moment, gaze steady, unreadable. For the first time, he wasn't looking at a target but at a mirror, seeing all his own flaws reflected in her quiet. Her answer was as simple as it was devastating. "We all have blind spots, cadet. The important thing is to learn from them, focus on the training." Then she turned away, back to the cadet struggling with his sight picture. No judgment, no indulgence, no revenge. That lack of vindictiveness was its own lesson. She didn't need his apology, but she had given him something far more valuable than forgiveness, permission to grow. And for the first time, Marcus Thor. How did a single moment on the mat ripple through an entire academy? By the next week, the Crucible was no longer just a training hall, it was hallowed ground. Cadets who passed its mats slowed their steps, their voices softening, as if some unspoken reverence had taken root. They remembered the silence more than the throw, the silence that came after arrogance collapsed in front of them. Vance never spoke of it. She never mentioned her service record, never leaned on her reputation. But her presence became unavoidable even in her quiet. Wherever she stood, in the mess hall, at the range, in the study halls, cadets felt an invisible gravity. They watched her, studied her, not out of fear but out of a dawning respect they couldn't quite name. The footage of the fight was replayed countless times, grainy, dim, but still sharp enough to freeze the moment her body pivoted and Thorne went airborne. Cadets pinned still images of her mid-motion on bulletin boards, not officially, quietly, as if keeping icons of a saint. No caption was needed. It wasn't the strength they worshipped, it was the restraint. She hadn't broken him when she could have. She hadn't gloated when she'd earned the right. That was harder to understand and harder to forget. Jenkins, once Thorne's loudest supporter, found himself replaying his own laughter from that day. It curdled inside him now, shame burning his cheeks whenever he thought about it. He started seeking Vance's advice in small, hesitant ways. She never rejected him, never reminded him of his part in mocking her. She simply corrected his form, shifted his stance, offered calm instruction. It unsettled him, because he realized she had nothing to prove, nothing to defend. Ali stopped boasting altogether. He had been a follower, not a leader, and now he carried himself with a new caution, as though afraid of echoing the wrong voice again. Thorne remained the most haunted. His punishment from Hayes was official, but the deeper wound was internal. He had built himself on the idea of being untouchable, and she had erased that illusion in 3 seconds. Now, everywhere he walked, He felt the weight of that silence pressing down on him. And yet slowly, he noticed something shifting inside. The rage he carried the first days after was fading, replaced by something quieter. Embarrassment at first, then humility, and finally curiosity. How could someone who had endured so much carry herself with such stillness? A month passed. The cadets began calling her lessons ghost drills. She'd work with anyone, struggling shooters, hesitant grapplers, even the ones who had mocked her. She spoke little. A tilt of the head, a correction of posture, sometimes no words at all. But those who trained with her began to improve at startling rates. Rumors spread again, not mocking this time, but reverent. Some said she had been on missions no one dared speak of, that she had walked away from things that broke entire teams, that she had been wounded more times than her body should have allowed. None of it confirmed. She never fed the stories. She just let them live on their own. General Hayes watched from a distance, nodding how the culture itself was shifting. Less shouting in drills, less chest beating in the gym, more quiet focus, more listening. What had begun as humiliation for one cadet had become transformation for all of them. On a rainy morning, Croft surprised everyone. He dimmed the lights, wheeled in a projector, and played the leaked footage on the big screen. The cadets hushed immediately. The throw played once, then again. Croft let the silence hang before speaking. "Lesson 1, he said, his voice carrying like gravel across steel. The most dangerous person in the room is the one you underestimate. Don't ever forget it." The cadets nodded, their faces pale with recognition. They would never forget. Meanwhile, Vance sat at the edge of the hall, her hands folded, eyes calm. She didn't flinch when they watched her on the screen. She didn't claim it. She didn't disown it. She simply let it exist. And that, perhaps, was her greatest lesson of all. Sometimes legends don't announce themselves. They walk quietly into the room, do their work, and leave behind a silence that speaks louder than words. What happens to a place when one person changes its rhythm? Weeks passed, and the Crucible no longer sounded the same. The shouts of cadets had softened into measured breaths, the barked bravado into quiet focus. Even the way they carried themselves shifted, fewer chest thumps, more stillness in the eyes. It was as though the silence Vance had left behind that day still lingered, a shadow shaping their every movement. She became a constant presence, not commanding, not loud, but steady. Cadets sought her out, some cautiously, others openly. She was seen helping a first-year who couldn't manage the rope climb, guiding his grip without saying much. On another morning, she crouched beside a nervous cadet at the range, murmuring a single sentence about breath and trigger discipline that changed his grouping instantly. Her teaching was stripped of ego. Every correction was direct, efficient, and precise. And yet she never told war stories, never bragged. She carried her past like a locked chest no one dared open. The cadets didn't press. They didn't need to. Her presence was proof enough. Croft began to notice the change, too. The Crucible's edge hadn't dulled, it had sharpened, but in a different way. Cadets were now competing against themselves more than against each other. The training ground felt less like a theater, more like a forge. He said nothing, but in private he admitted to Hayes that he had never seen a class shift so dramatically in so little time. The general only nodded. He had seen this before, in rare operators who left no need for speeches, the kind of people whose existence redefined standards without ever saying so. Thorne felt it most deeply. The once golden cadet now trained alone, quieter than anyone remembered. His days were spent in drills, stripped of swagger, hammering himself against his own failings. He avoided crowds, but he did not quit. Something in him had cracked, but through the crack, light was beginning to seep in. One late evening, Thorne lingered outside the Crucible after most had left. He replayed the throw again in his mind, the humiliation, the silence. For weeks he had thought of it only as his downfall, but standing in the empty hall he began to see something else. The throw wasn't about her defeating him. It was about control, calm, clarity, qualities he had never valued but suddenly longed for. The next morning, he showed up early at the range where Vance was coaching. He didn't speak at first, just mirrored her drills in silence, staying at a distance. She noticed, of course. She noticed everything, but she said nothing. Days turned into weeks, and the rumor of the ghost of the Crucible became something more like doctrine. Croft, who once barked at cadets to dig deeper, now simply gestured to the bulletin board where a grainy steel frame of Vance's mid-throw had been pinned. A reminder that words were wasted when action spoke so loud. Graduation loomed on the horizon. Families were preparing to arrive, uniforms pressed, cadets rehearsing marches. But beneath the ceremony, the shift was undeniable. The academy was not the same place it had been when Vance walked in, tapping her hands. The cadets were not the same boys and girls who had once laughed in cruel packs. Even Thorne was not the same. He no longer smirked in crowds or barked for attention. He trained with quiet intensity, moving with a humility that unsettled those who remembered him differently. The humiliation that once seemed like his end was slowly reshaping him into something stronger, not louder but steadier. And all because one woman had refused to play their game. Sometimes the greatest revolutions don't come with fire or noise. They arrive quietly, rearranging everything without ever raising their voice. Why did graduation feel different that year? The lawns were the same, cut with military precision. The families filled the seats in their best clothes. The faculty stood in their rows of medals and polished shoes. Yet beneath the sunlit ceremony, something deeper pulsed. The cadets carried themselves with a new weight, not the brittle kind of pride, but a steadier, quieter strength. Vance stood among them in her uniform, second lieutenant's bar catching the light. She hadn't graduated at the top of the class. She hadn't pushed for accolades or speeches. She had passed every course, every drill, every evaluation with calm efficiency, never seeking the spotlight. For many, her presence had been the true curriculum. Her bar on her shoulder was not a prize, it was punctuation. A simple mark closing one mission before she began the next. Her orders, whispered in select offices, had been different all along. She hadn't come here just to train. She had been assigned quietly to observe. To walk among cadets not as a legend, not as a ghost, but as one of them, gauging the gaps in their officer training, shaping culture from the inside. She had carried that secret in silence, never letting it show, never asking for acknowledgement. In the crowd, Marcus Thorne stood straighter than he had in months. His own commission awaited him, though it would not lead him to the special forces path he once believed was his destiny. Instead, he would march into a standard infantry unit, ordinary compared to the dream he had once boasted of. Yet he no longer carried bitterness in his chest. The arrogance had burned away, leaving something sturdier. He caught sight of Vance across the field. Their eyes met. No words, no gestures, just a slow, respectful nod. For the first time, he understood what real respect felt like, and it steadied him in ways pride never had. In the stands, whispers rippled. Parents who knew nothing of the Crucible's story saw cadets standing taller, quieter, more centered than expected. Faculty exchanged knowing glances. Hayes himself watched from the front row, his expression unreadable, but inside he felt the weight of legacy. He had seen many classes graduate, but this one bore the fingerprints of change. When the cadets marched in formation, their cadence seemed different, almost subdued. Not slower, not weak. Why did the legend outlive the woman herself? Because stories like hers don't fade. They root themselves into the marrow of institutions. Months after graduation, the Crucible still carried her shadow. New cadets whispered of the ghost, even if they had never seen her. Some swore the mat where Thorne had fallen felt heavier underfoot, as though it remembered. Croft, once a man of barks and scowls, adapted in his own way. On the very first day of every new class, he dimmed the lights and wheeled in a projector. The footage played, Thorne's taunts, the silence that followed, the effortless 3-second dismantling. The room always went still. Wide eyes, dry throats. The moment etched into fresh minds before they even stepped onto the mats. When the clip ended, Croft didn't shout. He didn't lecture. He just let the silence stretch until it pressed on their chests. Then, with a graveled calm, he delivered the same line. The most dangerous person in any room is the one you underestimate. Learn that here or learn it out there. Out there costs lives. It became ritual. The cadets leaned into it, repeating the story among themselves late at night, embellishing it in small ways but always circling back to the same truth. She had not needed noise. She had not needed rage. She had let competence speak. Even the bulletin boards held reminders. That still frame of her face, calm and focused as Thorn flew through the air, stayed pinned for years. No caption was ever added. None was necessary. Every cadet who passed it felt the same chill of caution. Don't assume you know who stands beside you. Hayes in his office felt the echo too. Reports reached him of fewer disciplinary outbursts, of more thoughtful leaders emerging from the classes that followed. He never mentioned her by name in official papers, but in private briefings he referred to her simply as the lesson. For Thorn, stationed far from the Crucible, the memory followed him differently. Each time he walked into a barracks or onto a range, he felt her shadow at his back. When younger soldiers looked to him for guidance, he no longer barked for attention. He spoke less, listened more. His pride had died on that mat, but in its place something new had been born. Humility, respect, a strength that wasn't built on the backs of others but on his own ability to hold steady. Vance herself remained silent about it all. She never asked how the legend grew, never sought to shape it. Legends, after all, are never owned by those who live them. They belong to those who carry them forward. And so the Crucible kept its ghost. Sometimes the most enduring teachers are not the ones who speak. They are the ones who show you once with undeniable clarity what truth looks like. Where do ghosts go when the halls they haunt no longer need them? For Vance, the answer was simple: forward. The academy had been an assignment, not a destination. Once her orders were complete, she slipped quietly into the next mission. No farewell speech, no ceremony, just a transfer order, a packed duffel, and a dawn departure. Her absence was noticed only in silence. Cadets arrived at the range expecting to see her correcting their grip, and found only Croft. Others scanned the mess hall for her calm presence and felt the weight of an empty seat. It was as if the Crucible itself had exhaled, lighter yet lonelier. But even gone, she remained. Cadets still murmured her name in hushed tones before sparring, glancing at the mat where Thorn had fallen. They carried her like an unseen mentor, one who no longer walked beside them yet guided them all the same. In dusty outposts overseas, her story followed. Soldiers who had never set foot in the academy repeated it around mess tables. The ghost of the Crucible. Each retelling bent the truth, but the core stayed intact. Never underestimate the quiet ones. Never mistake silence for weakness. Meanwhile, she lived the life of an operator again, her days filled with missions far removed from classrooms and parades. She never mentioned the academy. She never asked what had become of the cadets she had once walked among. Her focus returned to the sharp clarity of the field, where silence meant survival and precision meant lives saved. And yet late at night, when exhaustion pressed hardest, she sometimes thought of them. The awkward cadet on the rope, the nervous shooter at the range, even Thorn, broken and rebuilt before her eyes. She had left them with lessons, but they had left her with something too, a reminder that leadership isn't about myth or legend. It's about leaving behind more strength than you take with you. At the academy, Croft kept showing the footage. New generations watched, jaws slack, pulses quick. And Hayes, watching reports filter in from units across the force, noticed a new kind of leader emerging, quieter, steadier, more dangerous than their predecessors. He knew where it came from, though he rarely said her name aloud. Because some names live longer in whispers. Sometimes the greatest legacies are not carried by the person who created them. They live on in those who learn, adapt, and become something more. And that is where ghosts truly belong, not in the past, but in the future. What remains when the story is done? Not the throw, not even the salute. What endures is the silence that followed, the pause where arrogance died and understanding was born. Years later, cadets still entered the Crucible and stopped at the mat, just for a moment, as if stepping onto sacred ground. They didn't need plaques or speeches. They knew. The story was in their posture, in the way they watched one another's hands, in the way they no longer mistook volume for strength. Thorne, long since serving in distant units, carried his own quiet transformation. No one called him golden anymore. No one expected greatness from him. But his soldiers noticed how he listened before he spoke, how he steadied them in chaos, how he never underestimated the smallest among them. In his silence, Vance lived on. She had broken him once, but in the ruins, she had left the blueprint for the man he was meant to become. Croft, grizzled and gray, never tired of playing the footage. Each new class leaned forward, wide-eyed, watching arrogance collapse in 3 seconds. He never added flourish to his words, never softened the truth. "Learn this," he always said, and they did. Vance herself remained a ghost, moving from one mission to the next. Her name never appeared on plaques or walls, never in press releases. She carried no need for remembrance. Her life was not about recognition. It was about work, work done in silence, in shadows, for those who would never know her name. But at the academy she left behind, her presence lingered, not as a myth inflated by rumor, but as a discipline etched into culture. The cadets who had laughed now taught others to keep their laughter guarded. The ones who had underestimated now measured carefully before they judged. And those who had once shouted loudest found themselves quieter, stronger, steadier. The ghost of the Crucible was not just a story. It became a parable of humility, of competence, of restraint. And so, when the sun fell across the mats and the hall stood empty, the silence seemed heavier, almost alive. It was not absence. It was memory. A memory that reminded every cadet, every soldier, every leader that strength is not in the noise you make, but in the command you hold over yourself. For sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts.